Cool.
All right.
Yeah.
I think we're up and running here.
Good. That's good.
We're ready to get started and we're live.
Okay. So this is going to be fun. Thanks.
It is going to be fun. Okay. So it is past 7:30 and I'm going to get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Mary Talk of the season. My name is Jeremy Vaughn. I am the Associate Director of Alumni Programs and Director of Arts Advancement here at Mary Washington. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Mary Talk featuring Eric Gable, Professor of Anthropology, as he presents an anthropology of art, images and objects from a cross-cultural perspective. As you can see, we've had to make some changes to this month's Mary Talk format, but we are nonetheless glad you are joining us virtually. We're excited to welcome all digital participants of tonight's lecture, which includes over 350 registrants from across the country. That includes Portland, Oregon, and Maine, Los Angeles, Tampa, Detroit, San Antonio, and beyond. As with past lectures, there will be time after the talk for Professor Gable to answer any questions you might have. So keep that in mind as you listen to tonight's presentation, and feel free to write any questions in the comment area to my right, and we'll do our best to get to them. Before we get going, a few words about our presenter. Eric Gable received his undergraduate degree at the University of California, San Diego, and his PhD at the University of Virginia. He has been teaching cultural anthropology at Mary Washington for almost 25 years. In that time, he has published over 30 articles in scholarly journals and written 2 books based on intensive research on religion and politics among tribal societies in Guinea-Bissau, West Africa, and in Sulawesi, Indonesia. His book, written with Richard Handler, The New History on an Old Museum, Creating the Past at Colonial Williamsburg, is considered a classic in the field of museum studies. His latest book, Anthropology and Egalitarianism, Ethnographic Encounters from Manjeco to Monticello, is a wide-ranging fieldwork-based introduction to the central arguments and assumptions of cultural anthropology, and is an accessible resource to undergraduates and the public alike. He is currently working on a new book tracking how anthropology engages with art, both here in the West and abroad in tribal societies. Professor Gable regularly cites his introductory classes as his favorite. When asked why, he answers that knowing the lessons anthropology has to teach about human diversity are crucial to understanding what it means to be human. It is now my honor to present Professor Eric Gable. Professor, the floor is yours, and welcome to Mary Talks.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be able to give one of these talks. Last year, I got snowed out, and this year I thought I was going to get COVIDed out, but this is kind of like one of those family get-togethers where everyone has happy hour all over the world. So I'm really happy to be here. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you slides and then talking through those slides. And I haven't really done this before live, showing slides and talking through them, or giving a talk like this. So bear with me as I go forward. First step is to show you the start of this presentation. Okay, I hope everybody is seeing a new screen. And this image that you're seeing right now is the kind of entree image to the Virginia Museum of the Fine Arts. And I'm using it as an introduction to what is basically a sketch about what an anthropology of art would look like. And if you look at that picture, one thing should strike you right away, which is that we have a number of faces in a number of styles from all over the world. The Virginia Museum of the Fine Arts is a particular kind of museum called an encyclopedic or comprehensive art museum. And its goal is ultimately to show that art exists throughout time and across space. At the same time, though, it tries to show that there's a diversity of perspectives. So you see that all at once in this image. It's a very nicely done image. Now, when people ask me about what an anthropology of art should be, almost always they go back to questions like, when did art begin? Who were the first artists? And in those kinds of questions, they're assuming something, which is to some degree obvious, but also worth noting, which is that we very quickly as human beings, in our society at least, associate the capacity to make and enjoy art with the capacity to be human. Very famously, we often talk about this particular cave or set of caves in France, the Lascaux Caves. And we look at those drawn and or painted, if you will, sketches of animals that look so realistic. And we want to know what those people were doing, what they were intending. We want to know what is the function of that material. We want to know what the meaning is, and we also want to know if they appreciated its beauty or if they even recognized that it was beautiful. Well, one thing the anthropology of art can't do, and I'd like to start with that, is we can't go back to that moment in time. We can't talk to those people. We can't find out about them. We know literally nothing about those people in a sense. But what we do know is perhaps just as interesting, which is we know how people in other eras have interpreted those objects. Now, another feature of these objects that you see, like the Lascaux Cave, is that we assume that humans all can produce and enjoy art. And I think that's true. And I want to show you some images from my place where I did field work among Manjaco in Guinea-Bissau. I'm just going to go through some of these images really quickly. I want you to just reflect on them as I go through them. Go back. Now, all of these images were drawn by kids. And for any of you who have kids, you're going to recognize these drawings because kids everywhere, all around the world, can make drawings like this. And they look a lot alike when kids make drawings. And in some societies, they stop making these kinds of drawings, and in other societies, they continue making these kinds of drawings, or they go to school and they learn to make it better. But what we can say in a kind of grossly comparative sense is that human beings all over the world have a capacity to produce what we would call visual art that is recognizable in what it's trying to represent. All over the world, this is the case. And basically looking at the Lascaux Caves for many, many thousands of years as well. But that's not really all that important when you think about what art is and what it means and what it does. And for the rest of this talk today, what I'm going to want to focus on is 3 different societies and how we can use what we learned from those 3 different societies to talk about how we can think of art comparatively. And part of that thinking will involve actually recognizing that there are some places in which art as an idea doesn't really exist at all. And then there are other places where art as an idea, such as our world, exists so persuasively and so pervasively that we often fail to understand what those aesthetic and functional objects are and what they do in other societies, because we're so blinded by our own understanding of art. Anyway, as Jeremy mentioned, I've done field work in 3 different places, and one of those places was in Laogai in Sulawesi, and another of those places was among Manjaco in Guinea-Bissau. And I was studying both of those places not for their art, but rather because I was trying to understand their religions and the relationship between their religion and what we might call politics. Yet, in the practice of religion and in the practice of politics, what you immediately see in societies like Manjaco or Laogai is that they need to have certain kinds of objects that they use to produce certain kinds of effects on people. And these objects, to our eye, look awfully artistic. That is, they look aesthetically pleasing. And here I'm choosing two very abstract objects to give you that sense. The one on the left is a carved piece of wood in Manjaco, which is meant to represent an ancestor. And the image on the right is a bunch of different kinds of rice that's being slowly put onto a pile of leaves to represent the shape and intent of a spirit, and is going to be a sacrificial offering. Now, some more images. When I was studying Manjaco, and I was studying their politics and their religion, I became especially interested in ancestors themselves. And those ancestors both had abstracted shape, like the fork there, or a portrait-like shape, like the man in the uniform. But also ancestors were made apparent through a series of ritual acts, one of those acts being a funeral, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner. And that act involved the destruction of huge amounts of cloth. And so I initially became interested in the production and destruction of cloth, which also had an aesthetic dimension. The image on the top right is a Lascaux woman being possessed by a spirit and about to dedicate one of those ancestral offerings. Now, after I did research in Guinea-Bissau and in Sulawesi, I ended up coming back to the States, and I became fascinated with museums. And I became fascinated with museums in part because museums tell a story about our culture, both Western culture and also, let's say, American culture. And my first foray into studying museums was at Monticello. We're going to talk a little bit about Monticello later. But after I studied at Monticello, I did work in Colonial Williamsburg, and thinking about history got me back to thinking about art, a kind of long story. But for the last several years, what I've been doing is I've been paying special attention to the Virginia Museum of Fine Art and to what it does as an institution. Now, before we go on to talking about those three places, I want to remind all of you, some of you may have taken classes from me. I hope some of you in the audience have done that, but I want to remind you what anthropology is really quickly. And I'm going to do that with a bunch of images too, really quickly. Okay, first off, a brief history. Anthropology, modern anthropology at least, began as a discipline in the late 19th century and reached its apogee as a discipline, matured by the end of World War II. These two images here tell why anthropology came into being. And that is, anthropology came into being as a critique of, if you will, Western society. Western society assumed, according to anthropology, that it was superior to all other societies. And as a result of being superior, was not only capable of, but was charged with, if you will, needed to dominate the rest of the world in order to make the rest of the world conform to its sense of what it meant to be human. And that was thought to be a good thing, because other people were worse. They were more savage, they were more corrupt, they had cultures that produced less freedom, and so forth. But clearly, if one looks at the history of the late 19th century up to the mid 20th century, one sees a lot of examples of the way that so-called civilizations are also savage. So-called people who think of themselves as better and therefore good also do bad things. And here we see graphic images of that. In the top left, we have what's called a Moro in the Philippines, who was fighting against American troops, was killed, and then his head was cut off to provide a trophy image to be sent back home. And in the lower right-hand corner, we see a woman writing a letter to her husband, who's a pilot, a bomber pilot, about to go off to bomb Japan. And he sent her back a skull of a Japanese soldier, and she's musing on the skull as she writes her letter. That appeared in Life magazine. The other images on the top were traded and given among the soldiers who fought in the Philippines to their family. Now, that story of the Philippines of a bunch of savages links up to an American story as well, of our expansion into the West and our conquering of Native American people. And if you see these two images, notice the continuity. On the left, you see Marines fighting against Moros in the Philippines, and on the right, you see cavalry, US cavalry, fighting against Indians in Custer's Last Stand. Notice the iconography there, they're both the same. And to some degree, the point is that for the West, Europe and the United States, during that period, they thought of themselves as a kind of embattled minority, surrounded by savages, surrounded by people who needed to be civilized in order to make the world a better place. And anthropology came in to try to say, wait a second, you don't understand those other societies. You don't understand what makes them potentially your equal, and also what makes them different from you, and that you can learn through both understanding that they are equal to you as humans, and also recognizing that they have something to teach you. And in a sense, anthropology then formed, if you will, three strands of what we might call an auto-critique. The first strand was that the job of anthropology is to show that human beings are not merely universal. That is, for example, with regard to art, all human beings can produce things that are aesthetically pleasant, and they get pleasure in making aesthetically pleasant things, like those kids making the drawings. But also that people around the world inhabit different worldviews and have different ethoses, and therefore have different desires, which may make some of those societies, to take again the example of art, more interested in one kind of aesthetic dimension, and other societies not interested in that dimension at all. In short, the job of anthropology is to provide understandings of other cultures in order for us to recognize through contrast that there's a plurality of different kinds of ways of being human. In the process, though, what happens as you compare cultures, if you will, is that you end up hopefully understanding what another people's way of life, way of seeing the world, way of feeling the world, way of being moral is, that initially seemed odd to you. That becomes familiar, and in the process you defamiliarize your own self. You recognize that your own way of doing, your own way of being is not the only way, it's not the necessary way. And as a result, you potentially can change either the way you are, or you can become more aware of the way you are in order to be more self-conscious in your own life. Okay, those are the three strands of the critique of that anthropology does in regard to Western ethnocentrism. Now, I want to come back to art for a moment, and I want to begin by making the familiar strange, if you will. And I'm going to be doing this through art. Okay, these are three images from three different famous museums in the world. The bottom right is from the British Museum. The one on the left is in a German museum, and the one on the top is in Philadelphia. It's the Barnes Foundation Museum. Well, notice that one thing about each of these places, or each of these things, spots or sites, is that a bunch of objects are turned into a thing that you look at, a thing that's possessed, a thing that can be enjoyed. The Willendorf Venus, which is the piece on your far left, is a little bit smaller than it appears in this slide. But when you see it in a book or something like that, it usually looms large, like a giant sculpture. We don't know how it was used or anything about it. There are dozens of these that have turned up. But what happens to it when it's shown in an art book is that it turns into an object that has the same gravity, the same dimension, the same weight as do those sculptures from the Parthenon. In the museum near the Parthenon are a series of images or sculptures from from classical Greece. And almost all of those sculptures are of men. Greeks, the classical Greeks, were much more interested in the male form than they were in the female form, at least as an object where you saw the whole body. But again, these bodies are on display and they are an object to be looked at. A museum creates objects that can be seen. Now, what can we say from this? I've just written some notes here, and you can read them if you like or not, but let me just go through what I'm trying to get you to see. If we make the familiar strange with regard to Western art, one of the first things we have to recognize is that there's something that's happened in Western society, and that something has to do with the birth of a particular kind of entity called a museum. And then that entity spreads all over the West. Every major city has them. And then not only that, but people go to those museums. And more importantly still, in order to be a good middle-class person, I'm mimicking one right now with my shirt and blazer and also sitting next to my art objects up there. But in order to be a civilized person, you should go to a museum and you should enjoy what's there. And you should enjoy it in a particular kind of way. And that way is called an aesthetic way. And it should be pleasurable to you, but only mildly pleasurable. It shouldn't disturb you. Now, notice that museums are but one of a whole ensemble of different kinds of social practices and different kinds of institutions that make up what the famous sociologist Howard Becker called the art world. In this art world, there's an intersection between a museum as a public space and then houses like mine, what you see in back of me, in which people display art that might be like the art in museums in their own house. Okay, that kind of place involves taking art from all over the world or taking objects from all over the world and treating it as the same. And so to be an anthropologist, what does one have to do with this? You have to be critical. That is, you have to put distance between your own analysis of that material. And you have to be aware of what that vision of art occludes, what it erases for you. And you have to be attuned to what other visions and other places provide in the way of insight. And I'm going to try to give you a sense of that. Okay, now, before I go on, I wanted to give you a kind of history of the art museum before we move forward, because the art museum in many ways has changed rather dramatically, especially in the last 70 years. So very quickly, let me do that. And I'm going to do it by some images. The first is, I'm taking you to Monticello, which, like I said, it was the first place I studied as a museum. And if you go to Monticello today, you stand outside this door and then you're let in by the tour guide into this room, which is known as the Indian Hall. Now, if you could see the whole Indian Hall, you can't in this one slide. The reason it's called the Indian Hall is that's where Thomas Jefferson displayed a bunch of artifacts he was given by the Lewis and Clark expedition. There are all kinds of things that are included, anything from tomahawks to buffalo hides that are drawn on and so forth. And they're also right in the center, two sculptures of head-like objects with a small torso that were dug up and probably were from around the 1400s or 1500s. And then in that Indian Hall as well are various antlers, skulls of animals, maps of the world, and occasionally other things, including busts of famous philosophers. Okay, Thomas Jefferson's Indian Hall was right next to another room. And you may be wondering, why am I telling you about Thomas Jefferson's Indian Hall and all that? And let me open up a parenthesis here really quickly to just explain how this fits in with museums. In many ways, Thomas Jefferson's house not only was a museum, but he understood it to be a museum. And in some ways, people have said that his house and the way he decorated it and the way he shaped it was a precursor to the way museums came to be in the early 19th century and in the late 18th century. So now I'm taking you to a second room. We've gone through the Indian Hall, and now we're going into another room called the parlor. That's down at the bottom right. And there you see a bunch of reproductions of paintings that Thomas Jefferson had made for him when he lived in Paris. And these are paintings of famous people, but they're also paintings of religious objects and other things. And they're put on the wall, and down below is a tableau of various activities that people in Jefferson's day would have done had they visited him and had they been his equal, that is, had they actually stayed in the house, for example. And those are things like playing chess or the harpsichord or playing violin or other sorts of games and things like that. Now, those two halls, in some senses, represent two poles of what museums became in the early 19th century with regard to the question of humanity. The first one treats humans as part of natural history, if you will. Native American artifacts are put in juxtaposition with animals. The second room is about civilization, and it's about talking about progress and what it means to be a cultivated or a cultured person. Thomas Jefferson, as one of the first Americans, if you will, one of the first people to use the word American to refer to a nationality, recognized that Europeans didn't always think people like him were very civilized. In fact, they often thought of people like him as crude and less civilized than them. And indeed, even today, when Europeans go to Monticello, and I go with them on various tours because I still study the place, they're often surprised at how small Monticello is. Compared to Versailles, it's a little shack, really. Well, Thomas Jefferson in these two rooms was trying to say that human beings like him and other Americans could become and could indeed be civilized. But they also had a kind of root or a kind of origin in this other place, this natural history place. In the Indian Hall is like I said, is a buffalo hide. And over there you have a blow up of that buffalo hide. And over here on the right, you have a horse that was painted, an equestrian painting that was done by a British artist in the late 1700s. And now I want to tell a little story about Thomas Jefferson and about cultural differences and about art. And I want you to think a little bit about this as we go forward, because I think it tells us a lot about the state of the art of museums in the 19th century and going forward. Well, the first thing is Thomas Jefferson wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And in that book, what he was trying to do, among other things, was to demonstrate that America, a new society, was just as good as, or even better than European societies. Another thing he was trying to do, though, was to demonstrate to European intellectuals that animals and humans that were native to America were equal to animals and humans in Europe, and that Native Americans themselves were equal to European humans. This kind of idea that Native Americans could be equal to civilized people was a dramatically radical idea in Jefferson's day. And if you notice the horse on the left versus the horse on the right, you could see why any European might imagine that Native Americans are not equal to Europeans, that they're considerably inferior. The horses on the left look like cartoons. The horses on the left are crude objects. The horse on the right, if I blew it up, you'd see the sweat drops on that horse's hair. You'd see the way the horse is standing. You'd recognize the incredible accuracy of that image. So Europeans and most Americans, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Notes on the State of Virginia, thought that there was no way that Native Americans were equal to Europeans with regard to their cultural capacity or their cultural achievements. And most even assumed that the reason for that was because Native Americans were literally biologically inferior to Europeans. Okay, Jefferson made the opposite argument. He said that Native Americans were equal to Europeans. Their bodies were the same. Their capacity for creativity and intelligence was the same. And wonderfully, he used their art to demonstrate this. He said that their art, even if it didn't look on the surface to be equal to European art, if you understood it and could see into it, you would recognize the general human creativity that it expressed. Okay, now I'm going to jump up a bit to the early 20th century. And I want to point out that modernity, if you will, progress, becoming modern, is often about, especially in art, about criticizing what is moribund, criticizing what is old, what is taken for granted. And so some of the artists who we celebrate today are celebrated precisely because of the way they captured, if you will, an argument that is embodied in Jefferson's house about the relationship between the primitive and modern. And perhaps most famously is Pablo Picasso, who collected and looked at and spent a long time in an ethnographic or natural history museum in France in order to produce an art which borrowed the iconography of African art and other so-called tribal art to make an image of prostitutes that was ugly in the extreme, yet beautiful in its balance, and dramatically transformed the way people thought about what art could be. Now, I want to take a little stroll in a garden of a place called the Crystal Palace in late 19th century Europe, just before Pablo Picasso strode into the museum. And I want you just to see that one of the things about going to a museum then, and perhaps even now, is that you have to be a person of a certain sensibility to enjoy it. Being civilized enough or educated enough to go to a museum requires that you take on the accoutrement of a particular kind of class. You have to be, if you will, educated to be able to enjoy a museum. Nowadays, that education is not the same as it was in the late 19th century. It's not gentility, it's not that. Instead, it's the capacity to be able to experience stuff in a way that makes you capable of not being shocked or disgusted by that stuff. Here's another famous work of art that appeared at roughly not much longer, around the same time that Picasso was becoming famous, by Marcel Duchamp. And what it is, this is a toilet, a urinal, and the urinal has been signed and the date is put on it, so it's roughly 10 years after the Picasso painting, and that's it. And the point of this urinal is that the artist is saying that anything an artist decides is art can be art, and you have to be able to conceptualize art that way. It's a criticism of the idea of art, if you will. Now I'm going to show you another image, and I want you to recognize that this image is actually a work of art in and of itself. It's a photograph, a large format photograph of people in a museum looking at an object. And this photograph, itself a work of art, is also a story and a criticism of museums. Back to the earlier slides of museums. Notice that one of the things that we take for granted about a museum is that you go to a museum to look at things. And whatever you look at in a museum, whether it's a urinal, a bunch of naked, crudely drawn ladies, or a religious scene, they all should be treated with the same degree of respect and the same degree of detachment. You look at them, that's all you do. You contemplate them, and you're quiet. Museums, art museums especially, are quiet places. People whisper, they don't like loud noises. That painting, according to the artist who made the photograph, should not really be seen in that way. It would never have been seen in that way if it was in its real place. It is not being understood by being in a museum. So the photograph is an attempt on the part of this particular artist to make the strange familiar. And here I want to open a parenthesis about anthropology and about art itself. Notice that this photographer, Marcel Duchamp, also Picasso, are all doing the same thing. They're trying to make the strange familiar. They're doing it through art. Anthropology is doing that through discourse, through text, and through social science. But in effect, by the present, by the late 20th century and the early 21st century, both artists and anthropologists are doing the same exact thing. They're critiquing the same space. And that's an interesting problem. How can you study someone that's doing exactly what you're doing? And in a sense, that's what I'm trying to resolve in my book, how to do that. So now I want to end up with another little piece here that has to do with the another question about art and the art world in the West. It's something else we take for granted, which is not only do we go into museums, but also, like I say, we have art on our mantelpiece. We have stuff in our house. And that stuff in our house often echoes in very uncanny ways the way a museum was set up by people like Thomas Jefferson. A juxtaposition of two different kinds of being human, treated as if they're all the same and all equal. And yet, and here's the fill-up, they are used as a kind of decor that exhibits the classiness or style or intelligence of the person who's doing the decorating, i.e. Peggy Guggenheim is the curator of her living room. And in that living room is African art and abstract art and wonderful fabrics and beautiful flowers and a cashmere throw that she wraps around her body. Here are some pieces I grabbed off a recent interior decorator in London. And notice an interesting juxtaposition there. Each of these three images are domestic spaces, and they're displaying art in these domestic spaces that if they were in a museum would be considered serious and provocative. There's Banksy on the bottom. There's Basquiat top. Each of these people are high artists, or artists of high quality, if you will, displayed in museums. Yet in their space, in the domestic space, what they are is they're pretty pictures. They're ways of making color happen. They're nice. That's all they are. So one of the critiques of the art world today that artists do, someone like Banksy would do it, or likewise that art historians do, and ultimately anthropologists do, is we point out that there's something entangling about capitalism itself and about individuality and about the relationship between being an individual who can display their taste and being intelligent and being civilized and the museum. All these are linked together and they all have to be analyzed as a whole. And so the first step of any anthropology of art is to recognize that fact and to try to talk about the West in those terms. And I leave you with something just to ponder here with regard to that. Here are three art objects. They all deal with something called rape. Each one of the objects is heavily aestheticized. We look at them, and even the bottom right-hand one by Degas, we look at and we appreciate it as art, but we don't really see it anymore as a violent act. We don't really see it as rape anymore. So somehow the museum and the aestheticization of a museum turns things which have a provocative and powerful meaning into something much less than that. And so one of the ways that once we've made the familiar strange here, that we want to do is we want to come back to so-called tribal societies and make the strange familiar. And one of the ways to do that is to escape the idea of aesthetics itself, not to try to understand why other people find things to be beautiful, but rather to try to understand how objects in and of themselves, or images in and of themselves, gain the power they do on us. And here I hope I still have time to do this. I've gone about 40 minutes. Give me 5 more minutes, if that's okay, to try to give you just a sense of how we might turn our attention to non-Western societies. And I'm going to be trying to think about how we turn these kinds of things, which are clearly beautiful and clearly aesthetically pleasing to us, in part because we've grown up with abstraction and so forth, into things that are actually powerful and have a power. And one way that we can do this, and one way that becomes clear to us as we're doing research in the field, is none of these objects are frozen. They're not put on a wall. They're not merely contemplated as objects or images. They're part of a wider ensemble of activities that make them incredibly, if you will, powerful because of a multisensory experience. Monjako, dead people become ancestors. But before they can become ancestors, they have to die, and they have to be part of an exchange between the living and the dead. When they die, that moment of their death allows the living to kill a whole bunch of cows, which then will be eaten by everybody in the community, shared in very specific ways, who gets a thigh, who gets a foreleg, and then ultimately given, if you will, in spirit to the dead who are the ultimate owners of this. When the dead person is ready to go into the ground, they're wrapped in a bunch of cloth. And again, that cloth signals in its sheer materiality the fact of debt that living owe to dead people that are already beyond the grave. Because this dead person is not only wrapped in cloth, they're actually a vehicle to carry that cloth to the other world. They go into a grave fully clothed like this. The cloth is stripped from their body, and then the grave diggers come out of the ground naked with little bandanas of this cloth on their heads, as if they're emerging from this world into the other world as bearers of cloth and sheerly naked. Eventually, they become ancestors. And when they do, they have to ask to become ancestors. They have to shout. They have to cause problems. And in the act of causing problems, they have to be placated. And in the process of placation, they are remembered. And in the process of being remembered, carvings are made which represent them. These carvings are often disturbing to my students when I show them in my 101 class, for example. And the reason they're disturbing is because they look like white people. And we don't like to think that Black people in villages in Africa revere, celebrate, or otherwise look up to white people. It's a bad thing. It's not suitable to our worldview. And so we're a little bit repulsed by these objects. Well, after I show my students these ancestor carvings, what I try to demonstrate to them, and I would have to take a lot longer to convince you, but I don't have the time to do it, is that these objects are not actually portraits at all. Instead, and this is the part of making the strange familiar and then allowing the familiar to cause you to reanalyze something that you thought was clear. That is, from our perspective, we see these and go, that's a portrait, that's an object, it's a representation. But from a Monjako perspective, it's not a portrait, it's a performance that's frozen in a moment in time. It's a thing that demonstrates a history all at once in one quickly grasped look. And that history has to do with the fact that Monjako, in the colonial era, in order to be powerful, took on the activities and the intelligence and the civilization of the Portuguese. And they outdid the Portuguese, according to Monjako. And so what they're doing is they're displaying through the portrait of a white person the idea of civilization itself and the fact that they have appropriated it. Rather than being images of actual people, which we might think they're instead images of a cultural activity, a cultural appropriation. And that cultural appropriation is shown through the entirety of a funeral ceremony, not just through the object. But these objects may end up and have ended up in museums. And by ending up in museums, they strip that longer story and that more nuanced story. Now, for the last minute, I want to just go back to the museum. And this is the VMFA. And what I want to remind all of you of is that there's something unintended that happens with museums as well, which is that despite all our efforts as people who, let's say, like museums and go to them and appreciate them, or people who work in them, and by the way, all these efforts are to make museums into spaces of democracy, publicness, of sharedness, of everybody gets to belongness. Despite all our efforts to do that, throughout the history of the modern museum, it has also often been, or always, partly exclusionary as well. Sometimes it excludes people we want it to include. So back to the earlier images, notice that the VMFA has done a lot of work to try to include African-American art in order to get African-Americans into the picture. But also it sometimes excludes people who we may not ourselves like. The Virginia Museum of the Fine Arts got rid of some Confederate flags, and as a result, for like 10 years now, a group of people called flaggers have protested outside the doors of the museum about their destruction of their flags. No one really listens to these protests anymore in Richmond. It falls on deaf ears. But the protest itself, for an anthropologist at least, is a performance, which is a form of art which needs to be analyzed for what it does, what it means, and how it looks. And so me as an anthropologist studying this museum, I can't just focus on the patrons, the people who donate, like these two, who make the museum happen, but I also have to focus on those who are excluded and outsiders. In short, an anthropologist has to be holistic. In studying anything, whether a single object or a society, the whole of that object, the whole of that society becomes where we see culture at play. And that's my goal in this book, is to try to do that with art. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'd love to take questions, and I apologize for going long on this. I was trying to make it be 30 minutes, didn't quite work. So anyway, it was a pleasure, and I'd love to have some questions if anyone has any.
I do have some questions. Can you hear me, Eric?
Yeah, I can hear you really well.
Okay. I have two questions here. One is from Melissa Woodford, and she asks, this art collection element in the domestic, it also speaks to a kind of ownership, yes? Not only in respect to their personal identities as reflected in their tastes, how are these understood in post-colonial perspectives?
Great question. That is a one. Were you an art? Was she an art historian?
I don't know, but it sounds like it.
Yeah, that's really a wonderful question. And yes, right now, though, that question is becoming incredibly fraught. So, for example, Peggy Guggenheim's collection is being displayed right now in Venice as her collection of African objects, I should say, or tribal objects, is being displayed. And one of the goals is to try to show that those objects have a life of their own, and they have creators, and they have if you will, they have equality in a sense that goes beyond the fact that Peggy Guggenheim collected them. A lot of museums nowadays try to do stuff like that. They're embarrassed with their colonial heritage. They try to escape that heritage through moves like the move that's being done in Venice. It doesn't quite work from my perspective as an anthropologist, in part because, and this is back to your first part of your question or your comment, these objects, we're in a society that possesses, and possession itself creates certain forms of inequality that can't be erased through mere talk and meaning and semiotics. It doesn't really work. So when museums welcome in the downtrodden or the otherwise excluded, unless they're equal in class and capable of going to the museum, they still feel excluded and still are excluded. The museum isn't a good machine for creating equality in the absolute sense. And neither is possession, if you will, material possession, a good tool for creating equality. That would be my answer. I don't know if that quite got to your point, but yeah, the post-colonialism has changed things quite a bit, that's for sure.
Melissa says she's an archaeologist.
Of course.
So great. Thank you for answering that. I have one more.
Yeah,
Justin Sisk asks, could you speak to the alienation factor that occurs between the viewer of the piece and the artist that created it? Because there's a visual and mental consumption factor, does that differ from Marx's views on the subject of alienation?
wow, Justin, good to see you again, or hear you through mediation. So I hope you're doing well. And yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of people who are much more intelligent than I am, who have looked at things, who are art historians, have talked a lot about what you're asking, which is that in some senses, museums are embodiments of alienation. By the sheer fact that we distance ourselves from these objects and we treat them as if we can possess them, but we never quite get into them, maybe demonstrates in a very graphic way the Marxian theory of alienation. So yeah, there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for the fact that people often are become obsessive about collecting to the extent that they fill whole houses full of stuff and can no longer inhabit them. There's different ways that capitalism has generated so-called solutions to the problem of alienation, but they rarely work as complete acts again. And I think a lot of artists have talked about that too, and you're right.
Cool. Justin went on to say, good to see you and hear from you as well. I hope all is well in your world.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Those are the end of the questions that we have. And this is the point in the presentation when I thank you, Professor, for joining us this evening. And thanks again to our viewers at home for joining us digitally for tonight's presentation. As a quick reminder, this presentation will be available for viewing here and on the University of Mary Washington Alumni Facebook page and on the UMW YouTube channel starting, we hope, sometime tomorrow. There you can watch this and the full catalog of Mary Talks. And though this was originally slated to be the final Mary Talk of the season, I'm pleased to announce that we are working on additional Mary Talks for the coming weeks. So mark your calendars for 2 weeks from tonight. That's Wednesday, May 6th at 7:30. Dr. Paul Binkley, Executive Director of Mary Washington Center for Career and Professional Development, will be presenting Designing Your Life During and After COVID-19. Look for an email communication later this week with more information, including a longer description of the talk and viewing information. And then this is the part where we usually invite you to stay and enjoy some refreshments before departing. Instead, I encourage you to hit the fridge and treat yourself because we all deserve it. So thank you for watching. Thank you again, Professor. Stay safe and good night.
Yeah, good night. Good night.
Take care.
Bye-bye.